When reading data from a DynamoDB table, by default, it returns all item attributes. Now, in some of your application scenarios, you might only require a subset of the item's attributes. In these cases, you can use projection expression, which will limit the item attributes that are returned as part of the read operation. In this video, let's learn about projection expressions in DynamoDB and how to use them when building applications. Hello everyone, my name is Rahul and welcome back to this YouTube channel. If you're new here, I make videos on .NET, Cloud and DevOps. Now this video is sponsored by AWS and is part of my .NET on AWS series. Now without much delay, let's learn about projection expressions in DynamoDB by building and using it in a .NET application. The general concepts of the projection expressions applies to other programming languages as well. Now, a projection expression is a string that identifies the attributes that you want. To retrieve a single attribute, specify its name. For multiple attributes, you can simply specify a comma-separated value. This is very similar to how you would write the attribute names in a select statement when writing SQL queries. The main use with the projection expression is to reduce the amount of data that is sent over the wire from DynamoDB over to your application. Now let's switch over to Rider, which is the IDE I'll be using today. Now I have a solution already open. This is the solution that I used for my DynamoDB querying and pagination videos. All I have modified to the default Web API template of ASP.NET Core is in the weather forecast I have added a property city name, which is the partition key in the DynamoDB table. I also use the date as the range key as part of the DynamoDB table. Now in the weather forecast controller, I have added different methods to query and also to show pagination examples when using DynamoDB. Now if you are new to any of these, I highly recommend checking out my DynamoDB series, which will be linked here or in the descriptions below. So for this demo, let's copy one of these examples, which is the first one, that is the specific date, and modify this slightly to understand and learn about projection expressions. So let's copy this and put it all the way below so that it's right above the post method. Now we have a specific date. Let's modify this route's name to be specific date dash projection expression. And name this as get with projection async so that we don't have any conflict. Now let's put a breakpoint here and run this application and see how it's working. So let's run the debug. The application has started up the Swagger UI and it has the new method that we just added. Now if you look at the source code, you can see there is the DynamoDbContext that is getting injected in from the constructor. Now I have set this up for dependency injection in my program.cs. So if I navigate back and go to program.cs, you can see that here we have the DynamoDB client and the DynamoDbContext getting injected into the builder.services. Now if you're new to dependency injection and how it works in .NET, I highly recommend checking out my video, which will be also linked below. Now let's close this and navigate back to the Swagger UI. Now let's come here and expand this and execute this for one of the dates. So let's pass Brisbane, for which I have a data in my existing DynamoDB table, and let's also pass the date. So let's pass today's date, which is going to be 25 Feb and 2023. And let's click execute. Now this hits the breakpoint as expected and it returns back the data to our API endpoint. So you can see the information in here. Now in this scenario, we have only a few properties on the object. So we are not retrieving a lot of data in this case. And probably in the UI, we are also interested in the date and the temperature at the same time. But let's say if we add more properties to our weather data table, then we will be retrieving all these data back. Now to simulate more properties getting retrieved, I have added some data to my DynamoDB table. I wrote a batch script and updated all these objects to add a few properties. So this has the new properties weather details, the weather type, and also the wind data. Now you can expand these and you can see the different information inside that. I also talk about these properties in the DynamoDB custom converters video, which will be also linked here. So let's navigate back to Rider and update the class with these properties so that this gets fetched back as well. So let's navigate back And let's go to the weather forecast class and add the new properties in. So I will copy and paste the classes inside here. So let's replace this and paste with the new properties. Now I have a JSON converter as well. So let's do Alt Enter to apply the missing namespaces. Now, if we scroll up, you can see the different properties that's getting added. So we have the new properties, which is the weather type, the wind, and also a list of weather details. Now, this is a mix of information inside the weather data class. So let's close this and let's run this application again and load the data again. And let's see what all properties come back. So let's hit the debug. Let's navigate back to the Swagger UI and click execute again. And this time it returns much more data than we had last time. So as your weather data object grows, this is going to return more and more information from the DynamoDB server whenever we make a request. But maybe in the API endpoint, all we are interested is in the city name, the date, and the temperature information. To see what's happening behind the load async method, let's click execute again and step into the source code, this time when execution. So let's do F10 and press F11 while on this method. Now with the help of Rider, it automatically disassembles the DLL code and helps us to step into this application code. So let's collapse the debug tab and step in further into this method. Now you can see the different methods that's getting called on the DynamoDbContext class, which is from the NuGet package that we added. Now what I'm interested is in the load helper async method, and further in that in the get item helper async, which is the method that loads the data. Now if I put a breakpoint in the request.attributes.get, let's put a breakpoint here and also further below. Now let's press F5 and the execution will finally reach there. Now inside here you can see the attributes to get is based on all the properties that we have on the class that we are sending it in. Now in this case, we are sending it in the weather forecast class. So it is getting all the attributes that exist on that particular object. Now if I was to go and remove some of these properties, it will only fetch those many attributes, which means the DynamoDB context by default uses projection expressions under the hood based on the properties that you have on the class that you pass to it. Now since I updated the class with all these properties, it is getting back all the data. If I was to let execution go, it is going to get the data and then it's going to fill that into the document object. So let's see, this data has all the 7 attributes that is coming back from DynamoDB. So let's press F5 and continue this execution. So to limit the data, all we need to do is pass a different object or reduce the number of properties in this same class. But when building applications, you might be needing the weather forecast object in its full shape so that you can pass and read and update data in certain application scenarios. Now for other cases, you can create a stripped down version of this weather forecast class. So let's go and exactly do that. So let's create a new class inside our project. So let's call this as weather forecast list item and let's create a new class. Now in this, we definitely need 2 of the properties, which is the city name and the date. And let's say we are also interested in the temperature C. Now since temperature F is a calculated property, you can safely put that in as well if you require the temperature in both Celsius and Fahrenheit. So let's copy all these properties and come back and put it inside our new class, which is the weather forecast list item. Now if I come back to the weather forecast controller, I can update this to use the weather forecast list item. So let's use the weather forecast list item class and let's pass in the same parameters. Now since this is returning a weather forecast list item, I need to load a different item as well. Now earlier when we were using the weather forecast class, DynamoDB was using conventions to find the table name. So if I navigate back to DynamoDB, you can see the table name is also weather forecast, which matches the type name. But no longer does it match with the weather forecast list item. So in this case, we need to override the load async method and pass in the explicit table name. So we can pass in the new DynamoDB operation config and pass in a new property inside that and say override table name. In this case, we need to use the table name as the weather forecast. So let's use name of and pass in the weather forecast name. So all we are doing is adding in an extra parameter which is the DynamoDB operation config and specifying the override table name. So let's put a breakpoint here again and let's debug this application again. Let's hit the Swagger UI and let's click execute. Now in this case, if I navigate back to the query, let's collapse this. Let's continue the execution with F5 and it's going to hit the breakpoint that we had put earlier. Now if I expand this, you can see this is now getting only 3 properties, which is the city name, the date, and the temperature C. These are the 3 properties that I am interested in this particular use case, and the class has also defined only these. Now if I do F5 on this, it's going to continue and get back all this data and only that reduced subset of data. So if I come back to Swagger, you can see only those properties are getting returned. So let's stop the application and let's come to the other queries that we have in the weather forecast controller. Now if we scroll up, we have different methods on this where we use the lower level APIs to fetch data as well. So let's copy one of these and see how ProjectionExpressions works on that. So let's copy this full method and let's paste this and override that. So let's come right below the HTTP GET that we added and let's rename this to be city name paged range key admission, and let's also add ProjectionExpression just to make sure we understand this is for ProjectionExpressions. So let's modify both. Now let's put a breakpoint inside this new method that we have created and let's press F5. Now let's see what is happening under the hood in this particular case. Now the Swagger UI has opened, so let's scroll down and open the new method that we just added. So let's click try it out and let's specify Brisbane and also give in a from date, which is going to give all the data from a specific date. So let's give this as 25th of February and pass in as 2023 and let's click execute. Now this is going to get all the data from that particular date. So let's collapse this and let's step through this request. So let's press F10. Now it's getting the whole response. Now if I expand this response, you can see the full response inside here. Now in this case, the content length is 1080 and it has got 3 items. Now you can expand this further and you can see that this has all the items and the properties associated. So you can see all the 8 properties that's coming back. So in this case, by default, the query retrieved back all the data on our object. Now if you want to limit this like we did in the DynamoDB context, we can do that as well. So let's put a stop and let's come and add a new projection expression as part of the request object. So let's add that and let's add in the properties that we want to be projected. So let's specify the city name. Now if we need the date, we need to use the hash date because date is a reserved keyword. We saw that when we were using it in the query operation as well. So you can see here we have already specified the query parameter date as hash date, and we made sure to pass the appropriate value as part of the expression attribute values. Now since hash date already exists, we can use it one time and not have to pass it again. If you are unsure about what this is, I highly recommend checking out my querying video where I explain more of this. So let's pass the hash date and then let's also pass the temperature C property, which is going to be temperature C. Now, if you want, you can also use the string interpolation and interpolate these property names from the actual property names. So you could specify brackets and specify name of and also specify weather forecast dot city name inside here and remove this in that case. So I'll leave one of them using the name of and the other one hard-coded. Now using the name of allows you to catch this when refactoring property names. But you will anyways have to update your DynamoDB objects as well if you refactor property names. So let's leave this in here and let's press F5 again. Let's click execute on our Swagger UI. Now this time it hits the query of request and it creates the projection expression as part of it. So let's press F10 and skip over that. Now if we expand the response again, you can see this time the content length is much smaller. Earlier it was 1080 and this time it's only 326. Now if I look at the items inside that, so let's expand the response.items and you can see this has only 3 of the properties, which are the ones that we explicitly specified. Now in this case, we have also reduced the amount of data coming back from DynamoDB to our application. So if I navigate back to the UI, you can see all the other properties are null. This is because we still used the weather forecast object. So we can go back and update this code to use the weather forecast list item. So instead of returning a page item of weather forecast, let's return a page forecast list item. Let's also make sure we are converting it to the right type inside here. Now let's scroll up and update the return type of the function to be of the same type. Now in this case, it compiles successfully. Now if I debug this again and click execute, it hits the code again and it comes back with the results, and this time we have only the properties that we require and no extra null items. Now projection expressions can also be used to map complex attributes. Now if I navigate to my DynamoDB item, you can see we have the weather details as an array of information. Now in this, by default, there is a temperature and a string for one of these objects. Now let's go back to the item on 23rd, for example, and inside this we have the weather details, but it has multiple properties. Now let's say in the query request you are interested only in the first property inside the weather details. We can do that as well using projection expressions. So if I come back to the application, like when we were getting back the temperature C and the date and the city name, we can also get back a specific index of the list item. So let's specify in this particular case weather details and specify brackets and specify the index. In this particular case, 0. So now since I don't have the property on the weather forecast list item, let me add that in here as well. So if I navigate to the weather forecast, you can see this is a list of weather details. So let me copy that and paste it inside this. Now if I was to run this application again, this is going to return the weather details information, but just the single item. So if I specify the date of 23rd of February and let's click execute, this is going to hit the breakpoint. Now since this is a greater than, it is not going to return the 23rd. So let's come back and let's specify 22nd so that it returns also the data from 23rd. Now this has the results as expected. So you can see there is one item each inside the weather details. So even for 23rd, we just have the first item, which has the value of string 0. So if I expand this, you can see it has string 0. Now the second item has string 1. So if I was to come back to our application and specify this as 1 instead of 0, it is going to get the second item from the list. So let's click execute again. And in some of these cases, you can see this is returning as null because we didn't have any of the second items. But in this 23rd case, we are getting the value string 1 and temperature 1 as expected. You can also return back multiple of these properties. So all you need to do is just duplicate this. So if I was to get the 0 and the 1, I can do that as well. So let's specify both 0 and the first indexed property and click F5. And now if I click execute again, you can see this time it returns both the properties. For the cases where it had only 1, it returns 1. And for the case on the 24th, we get back both the data. Now this time is showing in my local time, which is why it is showing as 24th, whereas the DynamoDB table is on 23rd. Now if you want to learn more about how to best handle dates when using DynamoDB, let me know in the comments below. When querying data from DynamoDB, it has a limit of 1 MB. Now if the number of items that's getting read is already 1 megabytes, it does not read further and it returns the data back. Now projection expressions are evaluated in DynamoDB after the items are read and the 1 MB limit has reached. This means if you're using projection expressions to limit the amount of data that is being read and to increase your pagination size of the items, then that is not going to work. The only thing that projection expressions helps is with reducing the data that is getting transferred back and forth from the DynamoDB to your application and all the way back to your APIs. Now, if you want to reduce and increase your page size and get more items in your pages, you will need to use a different secondary index, especially when you have large items inside your documents. Now, if you are interested to learn more about that, let me know in the comments below and I'll do a video on that as well. I hope this helped you to understand more about projection expressions, how to use them when building applications in .NET. We saw how the projection expressions is automatically part of the DynamoDB context and it uses the type to determine which properties return back. When we were using the lower level API using the DynamoDB client, we explicitly specified the projection expression and limited the amount of data that was coming back. We also learned how to specifically index list or other complex level properties and get specific data from the DynamoDB objects. So use projection expressions whenever you are using a specific query to get back to show on a UI. Now, at the time of writing the query, the database and the items might be small, but as the items grow in size, you will be sending back and forth a lot of data. You can avoid this by explicitly specifying the properties that you are interested in your UI. If you like this video, please make sure to hit the like button. If you want to be notified of future such videos, please hit the subscribe button. It also helps me to grow this YouTube channel. Thank you and see you soon.